So does it provide short-term relief? Yes. How long did that relief last? A day. And fundamentally, the market is telling the Secretary of the Treasury, look, these measures that you announced, this market intervention, may work in the short term, but it's not a solution over the long term.
We're talking about spending money. Well, it's a small matter of 40 trillion that the United States is in debt. There's a plan by Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, to shrink the nation's debt. He has argued that the US government could effectively grow its way out of its debt burden, but can it? One person who knows this back to front is Mohamed El-Erian, Professor Mohamed El-Erian, who is a world expert on the bonds markets. He's Chief Economic Advisor at Allianz, and he's with the Wharton School as well. Mohamed, you're very welcome to the programme, and thank you for joining us this morning. I've interviewed you before, and what you do is you know it back to front, but you also can explain it to people like me, so who are not economic experts by any stretch of the imagination. I just wonder if you could take us inside this Fed versus the Treasury argument, essentially, in America. They seem to be at odds when it comes to what to do about the markets and how to deal with that mountain of debt.
And good morning, Peter, and thank you for your kind words. Let me start with why this matters. What happens in the US when it comes to the bond market doesn't stay in the US. Already we felt it in the UK because our own interest rates went up because of what's happening in the US. So what is happening in the US? On the one hand, you have the reality of a very large debt burden, 40 trillion. The number I prefer is the doubling in just 10 years. And this year alone, the US government's paying 15% more in interest payments than last year. So imagine your budget at home, suddenly you're paying 15% more on your mortgage and on any loans you have. That's quite a hit. So what does the US government want to do? It wants to lower interest rates, and they intervened, and they said they would intervene in markets to lower it. On the other side, you have the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has one of its dual objectives, lower inflation. And there's a lot of pressure on the Federal Reserve to increase interest rates. So on the one hand, the government wants to reduce interest rates. On the other hand, the central bank wants to increase interest rates. And if this continues, it will result in quite a bit of conflict as the year goes on.
And it seems to be a contradictory policy mix as well, as you explained there. The Fed trying to do less to guide financial markets, the Treasury showing a greater willingness to intervene. Just talk about the real world effects here, because it seems certainly that people who want to borrow to invest lots of money, perhaps big AI companies, for example, they may be doing all right out of this. But then, of course, when it comes to the consumer, you mentioned mortgages there as a comparison. Certainly, if interest rates go up, that is not helpful to the man on Main Street, as you have written about.
Yes, absolutely. And it relates to your previous conversation. The US is in the midst of an innovation revolution, if you like, that promises higher productivity, higher growth. It is led by artificial intelligence. For the reasons that you discussed earlier, it's allowing people to do more things. And there's, I think, well-placed hope that it's going to be even better. But it's not just AI. There's life sciences, there's robotics, there's quantum. There's a whole series of innovation that allow people like me to really expect higher growth in the future. Now, that helps enormously. But you've got to fund all this investment. You've got to finance it. And these hyperscalers, these companies that are leading these innovations, are borrowing very heavily. This year alone, they're borrowing $800 billion. That's 4 times more than last year. So that's put pressures on interest rates. Who gets hurt? The average household. Why? Because if they have to refinance their mortgages, they're paying higher rates. If they have car loans, as many Americans do, it's more expensive. And their credit card balances, and as you know, a good portion of the American population have revolving credit on their credit card balances, they pay more. So this is the tug of war that's going on right now. The promise of innovation, but it has to be financed, and it's a burden on households that then translates internationally.
What has been the reaction then from the markets to what Scott Bessent has been saying there, and do you think that's a positive or negative thing? Just talk us through your thoughts on that.
So I think it was best captured by someone who said, to use the American words, it's a Bandaid on a bullet hole. So does it provide short-term relief? Yes. How long did that relief last? A day. And fundamentally, the market is telling the Secretary of the Treasury, look, these measures that you announced, this market intervention, may work in the short term, but it's not a solution over the long term. And the message that the US administration is getting is the same message that the anti-Burnham government is getting. We need higher growth and we need some sort of fiscal reform.
Speaking of that growth here in the United Kingdom, because you've mentioned that there, the UK economy is running $2 billion above forecast from the Office of Budgetary Responsibility, the level of debt edging towards $3 trillion. I just wonder, we've heard a succession of prime ministers and chancellors talking about the need for growth. I think everybody probably agrees that is going to happen. But Andy Burnham's approach to this certainly seems to be to take growth away from the Treasury, put it into Number 10 North, his satellite office. Do you think that will work? Does it really matter what the Burnham administration will do, where civil servants are, which part of government they're part of when it comes to growth?
You know, Peter, institutions matter. And it's important that whatever institution is responsible for economic growth focuses on it. Now, there's a view in the UK that the Treasury is a fiscal institution. Fiscal comes first. And there's a view that economic policy gets reduced to just the budget. How do we make the books balanced? That's important. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. So the notion of making growth a broader responsibility, I think it's the right one. The UK is focused on two engines of growth. One is regionalization. Have more than just the South driving economic growth, and I think that's the right focus. The other one has to be innovation. The UK has incredible things happening at the startup level, but it doesn't scale up. And that is a real challenge, and I think this government understands this, and we're going to see not just the focus on regionalization, we're also going to see a focus on scale-up of innovation that can lead productivity and growth.
Do you feel this scale-up is actually possible, given that so many small businesses, startups, lots of the SMEs that are the real backbone of the UK economy are saying all sorts of things about regulation, about employment rights, about things like national insurance rises and so on? I just wonder how pro-business you feel this particular government is.
So it's early days. I think this government understands that growth is the solution. It also understands that it inherited a difficult situation. You just cited the July budget numbers, and it was a surprise. A borrowing of 1.6 billion when the expectation was a surplus. And if you look at what the problem is, it's not taxes, they're growing. The tax collection are at record levels. It is expenditure that is the problem. So I think there's an understanding of what's needed, but there's also a realization that the initial conditions, as economists call it, what you inherit is difficult. I think it's feasible to deal with it, but you've got to have this focus on growth, on innovation, and unleashing what is special about the UK.
I know you served as chairman of President Obama's Global Development Council for 5 years. I just wonder what lessons came out of that, do you think, specifically when it comes to the US economy now and perhaps for the UK economy too?
So that council was focused really on the US relationship with other countries, and in particular, the developing world. And the lesson there is the same lesson for a UK company, which is you can't be a good house if your neighborhood is a problem. And that as much as we focus on our own company, our own country, we got to keep an eye also on the environment, the neighborhood, because that spills over back to us. And the message for all companies is really care about civic responsibility and corporate responsibility, because ultimately a good house needs a good neighborhood.
Professor El-Erian, Mohamed El-Erian, thank you very much for making it so clear and very interesting in terms of what's happening with the UK's debt crisis. Well, maybe it's not a crisis, but there's certainly quite a lot of debt, and certainly what's happening in the US as well. And Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, and his big announcement on Wednesday there. Very much enjoyed speaking to you here on Times Radio Breakfast.